The wounded SS guard lay in the freezing spring mud, violently clutching his shattered leg. His immaculate black uniform, once a symbol of absolute terror and supremacy, was now soaked in his own blood. He was in agony, his face pale, his breath visible in the cold April air. Around him, the crackle of M1 Garand rifles had finally stopped. The American infantrymen had taken the compound. The fighting was over. The SS guard looked up through the smoke and saw an American soldier walking through the courtyard. The soldier wore a steel helmet painted with a bright red cross. It was an American combat medic. "Medic!" the German guard screamed in heavily accented English, raising a trembling hand. "Help me! I need a doctor. Give me morphine." The young American medic stopped. He carried a canvas bag slung over his shoulder, filled with bandages, life-saving plasma, and precious syrettes of morphine. By the strict rules of the Geneva Convention, he was sworn to treat all wounded men on the battlefield, regardless of the uniform they wore. The medic looked down at the bleeding SS guard. Then, the medic slowly turned his head and looked at the wooden buildings standing just 50 feet away. Behind the barbed wire fences of the Dachau concentration camp, thousands of skeletal, starving prisoners were lying in the dirt, moaning in unimaginable pain. They were victims who had been tortured and starved by the very man who was now crying on the ground for a painkiller. The American medic looked back down at the SS guard. His face was completely devoid of emotion. He did not reach into his medical bag. He did not uncap a morphine syrette. He simply stared into the eyes of the Nazi, turned his back, and walked away to treat the survivors. The SS guard was left alone in the mud to feel every single ounce of his agonizing pain. To understand the profound, chilling justice of this exact moment, and why the famously compassionate American medics completely abandoned their medical neutrality, we must rewind the clock. To truly grasp the weight of what happened that day, you first have to understand who the American combat medics were. They were the unsung angels of the Second World War. These were young men who ran directly into heavy machine gun fire without a weapon. They didn't carry rifles, they carried medical kits. Their only job was to save lives in the middle of absolute hell. Throughout the war in Europe, from the bloody beaches of Normandy to the freezing forests of the Battle of the Bulge, American medics strictly adhered to the rules of civilized warfare. When a firefight ended, these medics treated American GIs and captured German soldiers with the exact same level of urgency. A wounded man was a wounded man. Once an enemy dropped his weapon and bled on the ground, he became a patient. The Americans gave German soldiers blood plasma. They bandaged their wounds. They gave them morphine to stop them from going into fatal shock. The Americans prided themselves on their humanity. They believed that maintaining their moral compass was what separated them from the Nazi regime. But humanity has a breaking point. And for the United States Army Medical Corps, that breaking point arrived in the final weeks of the war. By late April 1945, the Allied armies were driving deep into the heart of Bavaria. The German war machine was completely collapsing. The American GIs advancing into Germany were battle-hardened veterans. They thought they had seen the absolute worst that human beings could do to each other. They thought they understood the horrors of war. But nothing could have prepared them for what they found hidden in the quiet German countryside. When units like the 45th Infantry Division and the 42nd Rainbow Division approached the town of Dachau, they noticed a strange, sickeningly sweet smell hanging in the air. As they moved closer to the massive compound, they discovered a train parked on the railway tracks outside the main gate. It consisted of nearly 40 wooden boxcars. As the American soldiers unlatched the sliding wooden doors, they were met with a sight that permanently shattered their souls. The boxcars were filled to the ceiling with thousands of human corpses. Men, women, and children who had been starved to death, frozen, or executed during a brutal death march. They were piled on top of each other like discarded firewood. The American GIs stood in absolute, stunned silence. Many of these tough, combat-scarred infantrymen fell to their knees and vomited in the grass. Others openly wept. But the true nightmare was waiting inside the gates. When the Americans breached the main camp, they found over 30,000 surviving prisoners. They were walking skeletons, human beings weighing less than 70 pounds, wearing filthy, lice-infested striped uniforms. They were dying of typhus, dysentery, and severe malnutrition. For the American combat medics, the situation was an absolute, overwhelming nightmare. The men responsible for this ocean of suffering were not regular German army soldiers. They were the Schutzstaffel, the SS. Specifically, the guards who ran the concentration camps belonged to the Death's Head units. These were the most radicalized, brutal, and merciless men in the entire Nazi military. For years, these SS guards had wielded the power of gods over the camp inmates. They murdered for sport. They beat starving prisoners to death with shovels just for walking too slowly. They unleashed trained attack dogs on exhausted men and women. They stood by the crematoriums and watched the smoke rise, completely devoid of any human empathy. Decades of intense Nazi propaganda had brainwashed these guards into believing they were the absolute pinnacle of human evolution. They believed they were the untouchable master race. When the American tanks finally rolled up to the gates of these camps, many of the high-ranking SS officers cowardly stripped off their uniforms, put on civilian clothes, and fled into the woods. But hundreds of SS guards remained behind. Some stayed out of blind, fanatical devotion to Adolf Hitler. Others stayed because of their staggering arrogance. They genuinely believed that because they were in military uniform, the Americans would treat them with the respect due to prisoners of war. They were severely mistaken. When the American infantrymen saw the mountains of corpses on the train and looked into the hollow, haunted eyes of the survivors inside the fences, something inside them snapped. The unwritten rules of civilized warfare were immediately and violently suspended. A fierce, unforgiving rage swept through the American ranks. Brief, intense firefights broke out across the camp as the Americans hunted down the remaining guards. In several documented instances, American soldiers simply lined up captured SS guards against the coal yard walls and executed them on the spot. They were completely unable to contain their absolute disgust and hatred for the men who had perpetrated such pure, unfiltered evil. But for the SS guards who were merely wounded in the crossfire, a different kind of justice awaited. A cold, calculating, medical justice. As the shooting died down, the massive medical triage operation began. American medics rushed into the filthy, disease-ridden barracks. They found thousands of prisoners suffering from the late stages of typhus, their organs shutting down from years of starvation. The medical supplies the Americans carried were incredibly finite. Every medic had a limited number of bandages, a limited amount of blood plasma, and a very strictly rationed supply of morphine. The medics began working frantically. They set up emergency field hospitals in the dirt. They utilized every single drop of medicine they possessed to save the dying victims. And amidst this chaotic, heartbreaking scene of mass suffering, the wounded SS guards lay bleeding on the ground. Many of these Nazi guards had been shot in the legs or the stomach during the brief firefight with the liberating Americans. They were in agonizing pain. But even as they lay bleeding in the mud, defeated and surrounded, their staggering arrogance remained intact. They expected the American medics to drop everything and treat them. When American medics walked past them carrying medical bags, the SS guards called out. They demanded treatment. They demanded clean stretchers. And above all, they demanded morphine to stop their blinding pain. Some even had the sheer, unbelievable audacity to invoke the Geneva Convention. Men who had spent the last 4 years violating every single law of human decency. Men who had thrown living infants into fire pits were now crying about the rules of war. The reaction of the American medics was unanimous, silent, and incredibly powerful. Imagine being a 20-year-old medic from a small town in Ohio. You have just spent the last 2 hours stepping over the rotting corpses of murdered children. You are kneeling in the mud, holding the hand of a Jewish prisoner who weighs 60 pounds and is slowly dying of disease. The prisoner is crying, tears of joy, just because you offered him a sip of clean water from your canteen. And then, 20 yards away, a well-fed Nazi in a black uniform, the exact man responsible for this misery, starts screaming at you to bring him a painkiller because his leg hurts. The medics didn't shoot the SS guards. They didn't have to. They used the universal rules of medical triage to deliver the ultimate, devastating punishment. Triage dictates that a medic must allocate limited resources to do the most good. And in the eyes of the United States Army Medical Corps on that horrific day, the life, comfort, and dignity of a single camp survivor was worth infinitely more than the suffering of 1,000 SS guards. When the SS guards screamed for morphine, the American medics simply looked right through them. They walked past the bleeding Nazis as if they were nothing more than invisible garbage. When an arrogant SS officer grabbed the pant leg of a passing American medic, begging for a doctor, the medic simply kicked his boot free, stared the Nazi dead in the eye, and continued walking toward the survivor barracks. Every single syringe of morphine, every single drop of plasma, every clean bandage, it was all given exclusively to the victims. The SS guards were left exactly where they fell. They were left to bleed in the dirt. They were left to suffer the excruciating pain of their shattered bones and bullet wounds. They were left to feel a tiny, microscopic fraction of the agony they had inflicted on millions of innocent people. For the first time in their miserable lives, these arrogant, sadistic men realized that they were no longer the masters of the universe. They were completely powerless. Their pain meant absolutely nothing. No one was coming to save them. No one cared if they suffered. The master race had been reduced to pathetic, ignored casualties screaming in the mud. Eventually, hours later, when the thousands of victims had been stabilized as best as the Americans could manage, the medics finally turned their attention back to the surviving German guards. But even then, there was no comfort given. There was no bedside manner. And there were absolutely no painkillers offered to ease their suffering. They were roughly bandaged, just enough to keep them from bleeding to death, thrown onto the hard wooden beds of unpadded cargo trucks, and shipped off to military prisons to await trial for crimes against humanity. War forces men to make impossible, heartbreaking decisions. It forces young men to witness things that will haunt their nightmares for the rest of their lives. The American combat medics of World War II are rightly remembered as the ultimate heroes of the battlefield. Their compassion, bravery, and willingness to sacrifice their own lives to save others is legendary. But compassion has its limits, and humanity has a breaking point. When the medics walked through the gates of the concentration camps, they witnessed a level of evil that completely shattered the normal rules of human interaction. They realized that treating an SS guard with the same respect and urgency as a liberated victim would be a profound insult to the millions who had perished. By refusing to give their precious painkillers to the perpetrators of the Holocaust, the American medics made a powerful moral statement. They decided that the tears of a monster do not require a bandage. They let the SS guards feel the cold, agonizing grip of their own mortality. And in doing so, they delivered a raw, uncompromising form of battlefield justice that no military tribunal or courtroom could ever replicate. What do you think of the decisions made by the American medics that day? Were they right to deny painkillers to the wounded SS guards? Or should the rules of medical neutrality always be followed, no matter what? Let us know your thoughts in the comments section below. If you appreciate the raw, unfiltered truth of military history, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss an untold story. Thank you for watching. Respect the fallen, honor the medics, and never forget history. We will see you in the next video.